So welcome here. While people are settling in and folks are still coming in, just a few housekeeping announcements here. My name is David Drieger. I'm a minister here at First Mennonite Church and be your host for this evening. There is a nursery and a single-use washroom in the room over there if you need to take the hallway there, or if you go out the back door and downstairs, there's washrooms in kind of the back corner of the basement there if you need it. And just a reminder, at the end of our speakers, there will be a time for question and answer. Those of you watching online, if you're using our website, you may need to click on the little YouTube button in there so you can get to the chat function on YouTube itself, so I'll let you figure out that at home. But otherwise, welcome here this evening. Typically, we would start with a land acknowledgement. Appropriate to the theme, which violence, whose peace. I was given some information this morning about a call that will be going out from the families of Mercedes Myron, Morgan Harris, and Tanya Niepenak. They are asking us to stop offering land acknowledgements at public events until the land is acknowledged by being searched for these women. So at this time, I will invite Michael Young forward, who has been actively involved in Camp Mercedes and Camp Morgan, and with the families in the development of this statement, and he will read the statement that they have approved.
Thank you, David. Thank you, David. There we go. There we go. Hello. In solidarity with the Harris, Myron, Niepenak families, and with the family of Buffalo Woman, we acknowledge that leaving sacred remains in a city dump is an affront to their inherent dignity. We acknowledge that refusing to search sends a clear message to those who prey on Indigenous peoples, a message of invitation to dump their victims in the trash over in Winnipeg where they won't even be looked for. We acknowledge that we need to be better than this, and we commit to living out in our day-to-day lives the calls to justice specific to all Canadians, 15.1 through 15.8 from the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls.
Thank you, Michael. So I typically enjoy organizing events like this that I hope will inform, change, and empower people to understand and respond to the realities of unnecessary and unjust suffering. This is important for me as a Christian and as a minister. I am committed to public expressions of the church that both reject private liberal individualism, as well as the public politics of nostalgic and nationalistic images of society and family, values that tend to moralize and condemn poverty, drug use, sex work, and queer lives. I consider it important to rehearse our deep tradition of liberation, recounting the civil disobedience of the Hebrew slaves, the centrality of Jubilee, which runs through the law, the prophets, and the Gospels, proclaiming and legislating the forgiveness of debts, the restoration of traditional lands, and the release of captives. I love the words of the prophets who tell the people that their worship is worthless and rejected by God if they refuse to address matters of suffering and injustice. Just a couple of weeks ago, I came across these words from the prophet Micah. "Thus says the Lord to the leaders who guide my people astray, to those who proclaim peace when they have something to eat, but declare war against those who put nothing in their mouth." According to this prophet, a system of unjust inequality is a declaration of war against the poor. It's important to remind people that Jesus said there's no rich people in heaven. He even tells the story of a man of wealth and political influence who is sent to hell for neglecting care when he had the power to make change. These are important and central traditions, and I usually take some encouragement from them. But rather than find strength in this tradition in preparation for tonight, I started to feel its weight. I began to think of the nearly 3,000 years of people trying to name and condemn the abuses of their society. It is easy to opt for cynicism, despair, resignation, or defensiveness in the face of these realities. It is easy to think they are lost causes. I have invited our guests because we do have choices, and they can help us shape our thinking and actions, as well as avoid cynicism and defensiveness. But before I turn it over to them, I want to begin with a very brief theological statement for those of you who came here from a church background, and for those who didn't. I want to make a public statement that may differ from a lot of what emerges from churches in the public. In the biblical tradition, idols are objects that are produced by extracting life from what is living and turning it into a dead symbol of power and control. When prophets rail against idols, it is because they believe idols steal life from the living. I think it is fair to say we live in a society based on the constant and even accelerated extraction, accumulation, and concentration of power in the form of wealth and capital. Our time, attention, and resources are constantly being squeezed to meet expected returns on investment. We live in the shadow of an object or currency of power that constantly and increasingly takes life away from the living. It is hard to care collectively. It is hard to invest in each other because everything is driven towards extracting the wealth and energy and resources we have. The problem is that many of the things that matter most about being human are not profitable in this system. This leaves people and organizations committed to the work of care constantly fighting for whatever scraps of funding they can get. The prophets of the northern kingdom of Israel had an interesting way of speaking about such a society. When a nation was based on idols, that is, when a country is founded and operates by taking life from the living, the prophets said, that king has caused the people to sin. It didn't matter if one king, one political leader, was a little better or a little worse than another. The order of that society was unjust, and so the people's lives were caught up in that injustice. But the responsibility for that injustice was laid squarely at the feet of those with power. Because I believe most of us truly want to help and care for each other. And I think many of us feel guilty when we're not too tired to feel it, as though we're not doing enough. But we do live in a society that is always making demands, attracting our attention and work to extract our value. Where the rich can leverage higher returns on their investments, make purchases at lower costs, and have greater impact on laws and policies. A society where then we as individuals are blamed for the struggles we or our loved ones face. So the church should be more comfortable understanding and naming the system of our society as idolatrous. Again, not in some sense of conservative moral depravity, but rather because our society is willing to sacrifice so many in order to accumulate, concentrate, and protect its wealth and power. Now, whoever wins the provincial election next week will make a real material difference in people's lives. For this reason, it is important, the election is important. But we will also need to remind ourselves that our next leader will continue working within a system that is working against the values that so many of us hold. In light of this, I invite the church to reconsider its idea of what is sacred. So much suffering in our society is cast off and framed as some moral or even criminal failing. I'm sure our speakers can address this far better than I can, but the markers of class and race, which drug one uses and where, how and where one expresses their sexuality, all play a part in how our society, its laws and wealth allocate dignity and support. And so it's hard to deny that our society has condemned and abandoned some people and places. Our hope then, as people of faith and of all people of care and justice, is to gather precisely in those places. This is not to be a romantic or naive sense of these spaces and these people and the struggles that they face. It is simply to say that perhaps those places discarded by society are precisely the places where we can learn about love and care, about kinship and intimacy in ways that are not determined by the demands of wealth and the demands that can only imagine collective care based on profit, blood, or inheritance. It can feel patronizing or even insulting to hear Jesus say, "Blessed are the poor." So maybe the only way that statement makes sense is when we understand that places deemed too poor in the eyes of the world might also be places that can escape some of the corrupting influences of our society from which something new might emerge. What I'm saying is that these might be sacred spaces. And these are spaces that churches have typically been just as quick to neglect or condemn. And so as a church, I don't think we're in any place to lead in these matters, but perhaps we can learn and repent and follow and support people and places that can help us value what matters most. And I hope we might learn something about that tonight. So before introducing our speakers, we're going to watch a short 5-minute video created by Manitoba Harm Reduction Network that I think serves as a wonderful example of the type of people we are called to listen and learn from.
I am a mother.
I am a daughter.
I am an artist.
I am a sister. I am a dancer.
I'm a father.
I am a professional. I'm a university student.
I am a good supporter.
I'm an advocate.
I'm a musician. I'm an artist, and I'm a community activist.
We're people. You know, we're just like everybody else. I work. I'm caring and honest, and I'm not a bad person. I'm a good person, and people that know me wouldn't even know that I do drugs.
I've used drugs, and I know that people want to use and they want to be safe when they're using.
Manitoba Harm Reduction Network is a beautiful vehicle to bring people in active substance use into contact with people that might be able to help them, or at least properly hear them.
Peers are community members that have experienced drugs, drug use, and they've been around and know a lot from their lived experiences.
I would become like a pseudo-counselor for my friends who are too shy or ashamed to seek help for themselves, and I say, there's hope for you yet.
The peer workers are there for support and to make sure that people are safe out there, and we get together to make changes for people that are doing drugs and how to be safe.
Like even get those drug testers. Test your drugs before you do them.
I can supply pipes, safe materials for them, pipes, condoms, whatever.
Almost all of the peers are trained in using naloxone, which is the opiate overdose antidote drug. It's literally used to reverse an opiate overdose. Almost every peer that I know has saved somebody's life.
When people give us a hard time, they think that we're promoting drugs. We're not. We're promoting safety when using drugs. Right now, the drug supply is poison. I've been to over 10 funerals in this past month. I've lost my niece, I lost my cousin, and just last week I lost a friend. I've lost 2 daughters, 2 nephews, and a niece like within a year. It's not because they took too much, it is because they're mixed with other stuff. Nobody knows what's in there, and one of the things we do is to tell everybody, like, check your dope first because you don't know what you're getting. You don't.
I just lost a friend. I've lost lots of friends to overdose over the years, actually.
My daughter's on down right now. I pray every day that, I don't get a knock on the door. She said she went for help 3 times and they turned her away 3 times. They keep telling her to come back another time. And I was going, I don't know if there's even gonna be another time, so it's difficult, but I love my daughter with all my heart.
I think that a harm reduction award would be super helpful at the hospital, because then people like myself can still go to the hospital and still receive the care that we deserve and we need.
I think we need a safe injection site. That would save a lot of lives, for sure.
So safe supply. If we know that there is a toxic supply, then why wouldn't we just, provide an opiate alternative that is not toxic?
We need the community to be understanding and more supportive and realize that we're losing lives.
When I came out as a person who used drugs, I lost safety, stability, and security. I just wish that we lived in a time and place where those things weren't jeopardized because I was a person who used drugs.
Bronwyn Dubček-Land, professor of criminal justice at the University of Winnipeg, as well as an active community organizer, often in the area of harm reduction and prison and police abolition. It was in her organizing that I first heard Bronwyn speak and was immediately impressed with her ability to integrate research and ideas with a clearly evident sense that all of this was meant to be in the service of collective love, care, and support. Our second speaker is Levi Foy, a member of Couchiching First Nation, executive director of Sunshine House. I've only recently begun sort of interacting and getting to know Levi, and I've been trying to learn more about Sunshine House in the last few years. And what was immediately impressed upon me was whenever I was in community spaces with various organizations, it was palpable the level of respect and support that folks had for the work of Sunshine House. And so very happy to have both of them here to share with us this evening. Bronwyn.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? I'm going to put this timer on and ask everyone who's texting me right now to stop. Thank you so much, David, for having me. Thanks, Levi. Thank you to all of you for being here. I feel like a little bit like I just, my brain is spinning a lot these days. The world is kind of spinning, it's wild, and I'm still kind of reeling from Wednesday when there was that massive demonstration of, white supremacist transphobia, and then the incredible outpouring of love on Sunday, where so many people showed up for trans kids. Levi and I are wearing the same t-shirt. We didn't plan it that way, but it's just what's in style. There's buttons at the front that are by donation for the Trans ID clinic at Sunshine House. It's been hard for me to make notes for this talk because I just wasn't exactly sure who my audience was, and now that I see you here, I know that I'm in the company of so many organizers, and I feel a little bit like I don't know what I'm doing here talking about organizing, and a lot of this is probably stuff you've heard before, but I'll just talk from where I'm coming from. I am involved in organizing with bar none, prison visiting rideshare. I'm a professor of criminal justice at the University of Winnipeg. I'm a mother. I'm a West End resident. And my knowledge of what I talk about here is really a mix of study and experience organizing, and from a lot of the people in this room who I organize with. So thank you, all of you. I'm also speaking, in this election context as a critic of the NDP because I come from an NDP family. Hi, Mom and Dad. I think they're watching. They're very supportive. I kind of grew up being steeped in a research world in Winnipeg that kept insisting that we study Indigenous people in order to understand why Indigenous people are policed and imprisoned. And I felt increasingly called instead to study the people I knew who were working in the NDP government and overseeing massive police and prison expansion. So that's been my preoccupation. I'm obsessed with the NDP. I've studied them, and I say that jokingly, but really this election, I think, drives home the point that I think a lot of us have known for a long time, that they really are a party that's committed to supporting police and prisons. It's really baked into the structure of the NDP. And so I say this by way of introduction to kind of like figuring out what the current scene is with the election right now and how we make sense of it. But I think that an important point to start is to say that we who are, on the left just have been strung along for decades now, being told that we just have to support the NDP because, it was an exception under the old NDP. It was Andrew Swan. Now he's gone. And now look, we've got new people elected and, new faces, even people who have been involved in abolitionist organizing. And Black Lives Matter has happened. And there's been a defund the police movement. So surely things will be different now. And yet we see in this election campaign that the NDP has really leaned into their position of being committed to being tough on crime. They're vociferously positioning themselves as the party of willing police and prison expansion. Of course, the PCs are as well. And I'll spend a bit of time in a minute talking about, the difference between those two commitments. But how do we relate to this fact? Rather than be depressed, I think we need to take this moment, this election moment, and the seeming consensus around, being tough on crime in the electoral sphere, and just let it really clarify for us that the work we need to keep doing is outside of election time. We need to be doing the work in an ongoing way that people like Levi are doing in Sunshine House, that a lot of you are doing in this room, that is identifying the capacities that people already have, that they're using to support each other to survive in spite of all these forces working against them. And to me, that's like refocusing to those areas is actually really hopeful. And it's much less depressing than thinking about our vote as the only thing that matters. So, to what extent does voting matter? Oh yeah, also I'm out of practice with teaching and speaking. It's been a while since I've been teaching. So I just am a little disorganized. Bear with me. I have a lot of questions that I'll pose. I may not answer all of them because I maybe don't have the answers, but I'm throwing them into the ether. To what extent does voting matter? In what ways? What has changed since the Conservatives got into power? What has stayed the same? What has changed since the last time the NDP ran for power? These are some of the questions I think we need to be thinking about. In terms of each party's record, the NDP has actually historically been much more willing to spend on criminal justice than the Progressive Conservative Party, and to spend in other areas as well. The Progressive Conservative Party, since being in power, has divested from criminal justice spending and also social spending. So I think one way to understand the current landscape in very broad strokes, with much nuance needed, is one where for 3 terms, oh thanks, that'll make it easier to reach my water, my extra long arm. For 3 terms under the NDP, from 1999 to 2015, there was massively increased spending on police and prisons. The NDP doubled the entire provincial justice budget, adjusted for inflation. They also maintained kind of a baseline spending on a social safety net. While they were in power, their investments in policing and prisons sure enough meant that rates of imprisonment rose significantly. When the PCs came into power, they began pulling away the social safety net, leaving very little support capacity and a lot of punishment capacity in its wake. So high levels of imprisonment remained consistent. Then, in the context of COVID, jail populations were cut drastically. So jail populations actually were cut in half during COVID, partly as an austerity measure and partly as a concerted effort to get people out of jails, which, it should be noted, is totally possible if we just make the effort to do so, because they were cut in half in the space of less than a year, and crime rates remained consistently kind of high through all of this. From 2008-ish till now, crime rates have been sort of hovering at a high rate. So crime rates exist. First of all, they're a bit of a fiction because, what is the category of crime? It includes all of these different things that sometimes it includes harm, sometimes it includes things that aren't harmful to people, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, that's a side note. But they fluctuate independent of investment in justice and independent of imprisonment rates. So, imprisonment rates went up, crime rates remained steady, imprisonment rates went down, violence rates remained steady. Throughout the PC's time in office, people have become poorer, more precariously housed, less food secure. The PCs have focused on increasing rural police capacity. People who are poor in rural areas are even more exposed in many ways to the policing capacities of social service agencies. There are many ways for sure that people's chances of survival will be increased by an NDP government in office, but we need to be clear that their promises to spend on increased criminal justice run counter to those other promises to invest in people's survival and well-being. Their mantra, tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime, completely ignores the fact that being tough on crime actually actively undermines community efforts to eliminate the causes of violence and harm. The causes of violence and harm are social instability caused by organized abandonment of people who are deemed disposable, people who are considered acceptable to undervalue, often through labels like criminal. Okay. Which violence, whose safety? Whose lives are in danger, and what does looking at whose lives are in danger right now tell us about the nature of the crisis we're facing? We're told we're facing a crime crisis, but the people whose lives are in danger are trans people, people who use drugs, people who are in jail, people without secure housing, including people housed by slum landlords who don't have locks on their doors, people who are relentlessly policed, people who are forced to work in unsafe conditions they don't have control over, including sex workers. The people who are being framed as the problem, the crime problem, are actually the people who are most consistently at risk of violence and crime. And I think, as David alluded to, they're also people who are most actively engaged in finding creative ways to keep each other alive, and those are where we need to be looking in order to offer our capacities to support and help scale up those mechanisms of survival. I also don't have a great sense of time since COVID. Like, how long is 15 minutes? Who knows? How could we really know? So I'm going to skip to the kind of like what is to be done set of questions. And just like a few principles I've kind of brainstormed to put out there for consideration, for discussion, whatever. We have seen, okay. Sorry. So, in Manitoba, as people who move through spaces in Winnipeg have seen, we've seen increasing surveillance, hostility, harassment of poor people through a widening net of police, cadets, biz patrols, private security, a shrinking of access to public spaces and public services, and On the one hand, public safety policy needs to focus on enhancing people's efforts to keep themselves safe, not intensifying the criminalization of those efforts. But one of the principles we also need to attend to is that social service is not the opposite of criminalization. Indigenous expertise and experience remind us that social services and rehabilitative responses to violence and crime can also operate on the premise that the person being targeted for intervention, for help, doesn't know what's best for them. So one of the principles that we need to have guiding our efforts to build community safety is to acknowledge and really truly believe and internalize and know and notice that people know what's best for them. And part of what the discourse of criminalization does is convince us that people, because they're criminalized, are messed up and must not know what's best for them, but in fact they do. So the most effective investments we can make will furnish people with resources and capacities to pursue safety in ways that work in the varied contexts of their unique lives. This means Indigenous self-determination over Indigenous lands and livelihoods, and investments in foundational social supports for everyone, rather than new forms of social control and intervention by social service agencies and police. So what do we need more of? What do we need less of? We need solidarity, not social service. So we need to build consciousness within our own communities. We need to identify what communities we have access to, not fixate on intervening in other people's communities. What communities do we have access to? What is their position in relation to power? What capacities do the communities that we have access to have that could be mobilized toward supporting the efforts of people who are most targeted by criminalization to keep each other alive in the face of this kind of relentless onslaught of surveillance? We can identify organizations doing this type of work. Sunshine House is one of those organizations, and Levi can talk a bit about some of that work. We can, give money to the mobile overdose prevention site, to the Trans ID clinic. Bar None, you can drive for the rideshare. Bar None, for example, has been organized on the principle that we see that the work that families put into supporting their loved ones while they're imprisoned is tremendously taxing. They have to pay money to visit, they have to furnish their canteen, they have to, provide emotional support, they have to do extra care work around the house. When we imprison people, we remove a community member, and the rest of the community has to step up in its place. So the work of the rideshare, we understand as acting in solidarity with the work people are already doing to try to keep their loved ones alive. And in the process, maybe building some connections across communities of people who don't necessarily see themselves as in community together. I've got 1 minute left. No, I don't. We need to we need to learn about basically the vastness of the carceral state, by our efforts to dismantle it. This is something that abolitionists have been saying for decades, but we learn about how these systems work and their reach into the realms of social service agencies and schools, et cetera, by trying to call out and confront the ways that policing, surveillance, interventions, redefinitions of people's problems in ways that don't suit their own understanding of their problems, et cetera, the ways that those things emerge, we learn about them by trying to resist them. So we need to do that kind of everyday resistance. We need to ask, where is the work that needs to be done to change people's minds, and where is the work that needs to be done to just force a decision out of people whose minds can't be changed because they're not, ready to give up power. And in the case of needing to force a decision from people in power, we need to work to change the minds of the people who we have access to in our own communities, and we have the capacities to do that because people's minds change not because of something a stranger has said to them or something they've heard on the news or whatever. People's minds change through relationships with people they care about and who care about them. So that comes back to looking for ways that you can mobilize for power in the communities that you have access to, and mobilize that power towards supporting the activities that other people are already doing for survival. I think I'm just gonna end there. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for putting up with my stream of consciousness.
So Bronwyn alluded to, thank you Bronwyn, by the way, that was really good. Bronwyn alluded to what is time. So I've developed this really good technique of when I have to speak, I drink lots of water beforehand so that I have to go to the washroom. And then that way I don't ramble. Anyways, my name is Levi. I'm the executive director of Sunshine House. And I don't have a sturdy table to lean on. I'm also a leaner, and I like to play with things when I'm speaking. So this is, just deal with me. I was reminded of, and in the beginning of somebody said, well, Bron was talking about the NDP, and I was reminded of something my dad had always told me was like, I always trust a conservative more than I trust a liberal. And I was like, why? And he was like, because at least with a conservative, I know where they're standing from, so I have a starting point. And I always thought that was a really fascinating, as I get older, it's a really fascinating kind of approach to it. So I'm here to talk about harm reduction. I don't know how to do that. I work in this field every day. This is kind of what I do. But I'm going to tell you a couple of stories, and I'm going to try to weave some stuff through this. This is also a really good reason why I chose not to go to the washroom, because when I tell stories, I just ramble. I think what I would like to do is I'd like to frame, and I think it's important for us to frame everything with a fundamental understanding so we're all going forward with the same kind of understanding of what I'm talking about. And I think that's really, really important with harm reduction, because harm reduction is a political buzzword, and political buzzwords have no meaning, and the more we use them, the less meaning they have. And I think that's really, really critical for us to think about when we go forward, because what happens with buzzwords is it becomes a mechanism to get funding, and because funding is for us in this field is highly competitive, and it's very strict, and it's very restrictive. So I think it's really important for me, whenever I make these talks, to talk about where I'm coming from when I'm talking about harm reduction. So my harm reduction origin story is not glamorous or sexy in any kind of way. Oh, I swear lots, and so I'm not sure what happens when you swear in a church, if I will get struck down by lightning or... Great. So I was living back home in my community. I'd moved back after I'd done my master's degree, and I had been working for Wichita Child and Family Services for 3 years. So my grandfather had passed away, and I decided I wanted to leave Couchiching, and I went. So my cousin, she sent me this job in Thunder Bay. It was for the Ontario Aboriginal HIV/AIDS Strategy, OHAS. And I did the interview, and it was really good, and they asked me, what is harm reduction? And I shit the bed miserably. I had to, at that point in time, it was 2012, 2013, I didn't really have a full understanding of it. So Jana Ray, she calls me after, she says, oh, I'm gonna tell you right now, you didn't get the job. And I was like, oh yeah, I kind of got that, just based on the way that you responded to it. She said, Levi, harm reduction is what we've always done. It's what we've always done in our family. It's what we've always done to survive. It's the way that your grandmother and our grandparents make room and make space for everyone, regardless of what's happening in their lives that day. It's the way that coffee is always on, tea is always on, the door is always unlocked. It's what we've always done. And that's my origin story. And so that's kind of where that happened. I didn't get the job, obviously. Some friends were like helping me on my job search. So my friend Lucas, who doesn't live too far away from here, they said, oh, you know, there's this crazy little lady who I think is gonna like you, and she's doing this weird project. I think you should work with her. So I'm gonna connect you two. So that's what happened, and so that's how I got connected. That crazy old lady was Margaret Ormond, and she was the former executive director of Sunshine House. If you don't know her, that's sad for you. She was a really, really incredible human being and much of my inspiration for a lot of this. Margaret always, one thing that she really imprinted in my mind is that the field or the area that we work in requires crisis, but by definition, we don't have crisis, because crisis implies a lack of resources. And in Canada, and in Manitoba, and in Winnipeg, we do not have a lack of resources to address the supposed crises that we live in. We do not have a lack of resources to help people meaningfully who use drugs. We do not have a housing crisis. We do not have these things. We have misdirected resources. And I think that's really, really important to think about, because we can do that. We operate the mobile overdose prevention site that employs 9 people almost full-time on the salary of 3 police officers. So I just want you to think about that. Like that's an effective intervention for from a fiscally conservative viewpoint, that is a good place to be, right? So I think it's also really important. So that is my framework for harm reduction. I come at it from the perspective of harm reduction. For me, when I think of harm reduction, I think of my granny's kitchen table at 5 Mile Dock Road in Couchiching First Nation. And I think about all of the aunties and all of the people who have shaped the way that I understand the world that I live in. And understanding that the world is relational and that we're all connected and that all relationships are sacred and require work and are valuable. I also understand one of the contrary ways that Anishinaabe philosophies do not exist nicely in colonial systems. And one of that is that in Anishinaabe perspective, punitive corrections of injustice or immorality are reserved only for the most heinous acts. And even in those circumstances, it requires thoughtful, meaningful engagement with everybody, and it's done on the collective good, on the common good of the community, of the nation, of the family, of whoever's impacted. And the world that we live in relies on thoughtless, careless, and unequal applications of supposed justice. A justice that's ill-defined, a justice that's unattainable for many people. In Anishinaabe contexts, appropriate social conduct, morality, and understanding what the common good, to me, is learned through behavior modeling, induction, repetition, and trial and error. And trial and error is the most important part for me. Correcting inappropriate behavior or inappropriate things that cause stress or may cause harm to other members of your community, of your nation, or in the environment is done by assessing the individual's balance and the balance within relationships and the relationships that individual has with the world around them. And collective good can only be achieved if an individual is healthy. and through individual successes. And that is how we measure good, and that is how we measure morality, is if everybody is healthy, and and I mean everybody in the human form and the non-human form. So everything that we have relationships with. I'm not going to talk too much about language because that's not really my forte. So harm reduction itself it's what we've always done. Practically, to me, that means get the person through the day. How do we get through the day? Because we live in a hard, hostile world, and we always have as human beings. We've created situations that, as socially, we create hostile environments. We create environments that don't necessarily integrate nicely into the natural world, so we're always operating from a place of balance, from a place of imbalance, striving for balance. So how do we merge that how do we do that? And you do that through creating hope, and you do that through generating hope. And how you generate hope is different, and it's different for so many people. So that's kind of my theoretical framework to what it is that we do. So now I'm going to roughly transition into, that's where I come from. And that's not necessarily the kind of philosophy of Sunshine House. This is just the philosophy of the way that I view the world and what I bring to the table. So at Sunshine House, we're a community neighborhood resource and drop-in center, and that means nothing. Like, it literally means nothing because we do so many weird, absurd things, and what it really does, what our focus is just how do we get our community through the day. We do not have the answers. We are not the experts. We do not know. They know, people know, everyone that we work with knows. I know from my own experiences what I need to survive for that day, and that's what we're going to do. If we can implement things that'll help people cope with day-to-day realities, great, that's wonderful. Sunshine House is an Indigenous-led organization, so myself and three of the other program coordinators are Indigenous. The other program coordinator is Black, so it's an Indigenous and Black-led organization. It's a queer organization. It really is just an opportunity for us to hire our friends, because we know, like, it's hard out there when you're queer. It's all centered around three basic tenets of respect, safety, and inclusion. Those are just the three things that we do. It's kind of modeled after an auntie's house, so it just has to feel like an auntie's house. When you walk in there, it should feel safe. There should be kin, there should be food, there should be coffee, probably smells of cigarettes, and there's probably a stain and some wild cats running around. So what we do works for us, and it's not a model that can necessarily be translated to other places. Right now, we're open 7 days a week through our different programs. We see tons of people, so we have a lot of quantity and we have a lot of quality relationships that are developed. So for example, on Saturday, which is our slow days, there was 230 people that went through MOPS, so Mobile Overdose Prevention Site, what I'll talk about in a second, and about 130 people that went through the Sunshine House doors at 646 Logan in a 3-hour period, 4-hour period. Last year alone, MOPS, so the Mobile Overdose Prevention Site, if you're not aware, is an RV that's been hastily converted into a supervised consumption site that also provides a number of different services, such as drug checking, just basic harm reduction support, such as providing people with supplies and materials that they need to get through the day, whether that be clean meth smoking kits, clean crack kits, condoms, syringes, that kind of stuff. Information about different programs that are available throughout the city. We can provide direct referral services into Main Street Projects Detox. We can provide referral services into rapid access to addiction medicine. And then people can be referred into any of the programs that we have available at Sunshine House. So if you're queer, that could be queer housing supports. If you need ID, perhaps Rowan can help you with some ID stuff. If you need a place to just grab a meal a couple of times, you can do that. So we opened it on October 28th of last year, and as of August 15th, we had 17,000 people come through that door, and about 60% of those 17,000 visits were people who were using substances. Of those 6,000 people I'm bad at math, I'm gay, so I don't know what that is, like 9,000, I think it's about 6 to 7,500 different types of consumptions that happened in that period. There were 19 overdoses or accidental overdoses or interventions where staff or volunteers had to administer naloxone. If you were to graph it, if I was a technical prepared person, I would have a graph with all these beautiful numbers, but I'm not that person, and you would see that the bulk of them happened at the beginning of our relationship formation period, and then in the month of August and July, for example, we had 2 interventions. So most of them were happening in February, March, April, and then there's been a steep decline. Our peers, our counterparts in other organizations are seeing interventions sometimes daily and sometimes maybe 2 or 3 times a week. So what that indicates to me is a whole bunch of problems. It means that A, we're not big enough. We don't have enough capacity to support people, but fundamentally, that principle or that focus on relationality and being able to provide people with care or support that they can immediately connect to is ideal. And when we do that, people are able to make informed decisions and proper decisions about their own health, about what they need to get through that day, etc. Sunshine House as itself, at our drop-in center, we have not had to administer naloxone or call paramedics or do anything like that in 6.5 months, whereas other drop-in centers are seeing them happen once a month, once a week, once a day. I'm not saying, oh, we're so much better. It's probably because if someone goes in our washroom, there's 3 other people knocking on the door immediately being like, we need to use the washroom. And it's like, so it's not like we're doing anything better, but it's just that's kind of what it is. The motto has always been recreation is a form of harm prevention. So if you can give people something to do, people have something to look forward to, maybe they don't need to use as much substances at that moment. Sorry, I lost my spot. So so what this comes down to for me, and I guess the thing that I see that happens every day at Sunshine House, that gets reaffirmed in every interaction that I'm fortunate to witness between either staff, volunteers, participants to participants, is the practicing and the embodiment of absolute love. And so absolute love for me is rooted in, I was taught by an elder that I was very fortunate to know from Nigagusa, which is across the lake from my community. Her name was Nancy Jones, and she talked a lot about, she was a linguist. Whether she would call herself a linguist, I don't know, but she would really explain concepts to folks like me who don't have a command of the language in beautiful, simple, digestible ways. And so the verb that we would use for absolute love, it would be the verb shawinimin. And shawinimin means, it's ja, which is to mean blessed, so that's the root. And then enim, which is the act by or the thought of or the feel about. And so when you put those 2 things together, it means deep meaning of love, of care, of appreciation, and it is unconditional. It is not bound by any specific, and when you enter into a relationship with anyone, those are some of the philosophies and practices that you have to achieve that. It is therapy. She says in this one video, she says it's therapy to use on one another. So it's a way that we are supposed to guide the way that we engage with one another. Absolute love should not be revolutionary, but because we are existing in as Bronwyn had pointed out, in an environment where there are structures of power that are dependent on the marginalization and the continued and ongoing oppression of certain segments of our population, so thank you, Bronwyn, for laying that out for us. We also have to acknowledge that that absolute love is a threatening position to some of the fundamentals of what we understand of what Canada and Manitoba have been built on. Canada and Manitoba, particularly Manitoba, is built on the supposed moral and civil superiority of one population over the other. The reason Manitoba exists is because Louis Riel was such a threat. The reason that we were able to create Manitoba and Saskatchewan in the way that it was done and was because there was such a threat, because Indigenous peoples in these territories, in all territories, but particularly here, were actively engaged in resistance to the state of Canada and the imposition of Canada. And we structured Manitoba, and particularly the prairie provinces, and we imposed numerous different laws and regulations on the movement and the ability of Indigenous peoples in these territories to govern themselves and to govern and to live in harmony in their own territories. It's also much easier to galvanize people around hate. It's much easier to keep people actively engaged in the processes of hate because it's simple. And we're told that love is complicated, and we're told that being able to exist in relation with one another is a supposedly difficult, messy thing to do, but it's not. The three ingredients that you need just to kind of manifest or to create this moral panic around certain things, around crime, around substance use, around homelessness, are just three very simple ingredients that get reinforced daily through our own interactions with one another, through media, through different social institutions. You create a threat, you create fear, and you have the most, and you exterminate the problem however you want to do that. In Canada, we often codify and we create different ways of exterminating the problem or removing the problem so you don't have to fully address it. So that brings me, so that's the thing that we're confronted with all the time, every day. We're confronted with people who are navigating systems that are predicated and supported by the extermination of people or the extermination of a threat without going to the root, and not creating systems or structures of powers that are rooted in love and rooted in that kind of fundamental philosophy. So harm reduction and kind of what needs to be done in this environment, I don't know. Like, I don't have the answers because it's all different. Your communities are different, your relationships with one another are different, and all of that relationality is different. But what needs to be done is we need to understand, we need to be always working from the very simple starting point that every single human being is deserving and needs unconditional love. They need that unconditional love that is not predicated on these ideas that just because you use drugs, you are less than. Just because you are Indigenous, you are immediately less than. You are inferior to me. Just because you are queer, you are inferior to me. You are a threat to me. You are a threat to my children. That is not a good framework for developing policy, and that is not a good framework for managing a civil society. We had moments, we had very, very brief moments during the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic of what a new common good could look like. We had moments where people deeply cared for one another, where we took precautions, where we valued each member of society, and we did things out of our norm to do that. For some people, that was so uncomfortable, and that was so scary to be able to do that because it was so threatening to the systems of power that it just was like, let's mess shit up. So you had the convoy, and you had extreme galvanization on people who were continue to be marginalized by systems. I think, going forward, I want to go back to that initial step, is that I don't necessarily have I'm not necessarily persuaded one way or another. I'm not going to come up here and tell you, like there's an orange wave coming or something like that, because I don't believe it, and I don't necessarily believe that an NDP government is going to be better for all of us all the time. I do want to be clear, though, that that this election and going forward, all elections and all of our engagement in society is a referendum on what we hold to be our values and our common good. And so whatever it is, and it's more pronounced now than it ever was. Not than it ever was, but it's more pronounced now than it has been in the last 10 to 15 years, because we're seeing the way that we live in a hopeless environment, and we live in people capitalizing on the lack of hope that people have. My people who are younger than me have lived through multiple different economic collapses. I asked one of my coworkers who's in their mid-20s yesterday, I said, what is your end goal? What is your dream? One day I would like to be able to buy a house. That is it. This was the norm for many of our parents, and that was it. It wasn't, I would like to buy a mansion. It was, I would like to buy a house so that I wouldn't have to live in an apartment my whole life. That's it. We're living through multiple different environmental, that is an actual crisis. So environmental crisis and environmental degradation is a crisis. But again, in Canada, we have the means and we have the resources to apply to this if we wanted to. But people who are my nieces and my nephews and my nibblings and all of those folks are not going to be able to live and breathe and drink the water that I did and breathe the air that I do. Because that's just not going to be a reality. They're not going to be able to farm. They're not going to be able to produce the same types of crops. We can't engage in the same types of economic activities that we did when my father was a trapper. Like that's how we lived. My father was a trapper for the first, I think, 9 years of my life. And he still continued to be a trapper until I was about 12 years old, doing it part-time. But now that's not a reality that any of us can engage in. There's fear of hunting in our territories. There's fear of what the animals might pass on. There's a severe imbalance happening all over the place. And so in order for us to not address that, we focus on these other problems and we manufacture all of these other crises so that we don't have to actually address the real crisis, is that human beings, our time is up unless we actually figure out what it is our collective good is and whether or not our collective good encompasses all living creatures on this earth. And I think that's where I want to end. Thank you.
I hope it comes as a compliment. You're a bit of a preacher there, Levi. Thank you so much, both of you, for your input. We certainly have some time for questions. If you kind of have one in your head, or you would like to, maybe you can make your way here already so we don't have a bunch of transition time that way. I might get the ball rolling. Bronwyn, I appreciated your comment about a bit of the culture work that we try to do, the changing of hearts and minds, and I wonder if both of you could speak to maybe experiences where you've seen the results of culture work where people have changed, and maybe cautionary tales where no, this is just culture wars, just you need to disengage and find another medium. If you could speak a little bit to those, the work that we try to do to make change, and maybe some of the cautions around that.
Thanks, David. Levi, do you want to stand beside me in our matching shirts? Yeah, thanks for that question. I teach in a criminal justice department, so I teach students who I dearly love, some of who are maybe watching today, who are maybe already police officers or are training to be police officers and corrections officers and are really picturing themselves in those positions. And I'm an abolitionist and I'm open about that. But I think that one of the things that I have come to understand so much is that people are full of contradictions, and just like, capitalism, those contradictions can be exploited, and they can be, exploited is a bad word. They can be pried open, they can be identified. Same with on the rides. So at the same time as, a correctional officer is socialized into a position of locking someone in a cage, which is a really bad soul-destroying job, they are also at the front lines of knowing how much prisons don't work. They maybe don't know it as well as the prisoner, but there's a lot of knowledge and information, I think, in every corner of people who are sometimes written off as being immovable. And I think that one of the ways that we and also on rides like that we give for the ride share, I think often it's interesting to note how people whose loved ones are subject to criminalization, who are visiting people in jail, they're totally capable of narrating their own experience in very normative terms, like, oh yeah, the person I love I'm visiting, yeah, they did something bad, they messed up, whatever. Yeah, they're serving their time. And then if you give any sort of opening at all to the idea that, we're abolitionists, that's why we organize this, they're like, yeah, it really doesn't work, and I think both of those things are true. It's not that people are lying, it's that people hold contradictory experiences, and experience does not equal consciousness, right? We can have experiences, but we need those experiences to be built into a collective conscious of what those experiences mean in relation to the systems around us and what that means for how we need to participate in, change because of it. Yeah. I saw two former master's students who, when they were in my class, they both worked in corrections, and now they don't anymore. So that's a W.
Here's your chance. You got them right here. What would you say, so my experience of creating a supervised consumption site, or my conversations with folks is I know someone from Lethbridge. He was open to it in principle, and then it happened, and has just I don't even know how he would have framed it. So now it becomes its own little ghetto of its own suffering and challenges and stuff like that. And I don't know what the realities are of that, but I feel like that's a bit of the narrative that I hear when people might say, "Oh, this is the typical sort of this is good in idea, but in execution, this is sort of what happens." So you have the stats that would sort of correct that in that experience. I guess what I'm wondering is, what I'm concerned about with a lot of things is when you insert it into, so if you insert a safe consumption site or supervised consumption site and you don't still have a means of adequate housing, are you set, how, I don't want to set things up for failure, right? Like if you set something up in the midst of a lack of all kinds of other supports, how do you, is this just the work? This is just the ongoing work that these are all pieces, and you keep pushing for that, or I don't know. I didn't have a well-formulated question here. I'm just thinking about when I hear people talk about it, and it becomes, like you said, it's a buzzword, it's a political topic, and then they have, well, I heard so-and-so, this is what happened here when they tried it, kind of thing.
I think fundamentally, again, you're complicating a problem, and for one thing. So, if you have two issues you've talked to, you have drug use or consumption of substances, and then you have housing or a lack thereof of housing. The reality is that many people, those things are intersectional. People might use substances because they might use substances, or they might need to use a supervised consumption site because they don't have housing. That's not always the case, because a lot of the times people use supervised consumption sites or overdose prevention sites because they are housed, but they don't have anyone there in case their drugs are toxic, or in case they have a negative reaction and they need somebody to intervene, and that's why we exist, part of the reason that we exist. One of the things that Jamil from Main Street Project said in a meeting that we had a couple of weeks ago, he said two really important things that really changed my mind about how I approach this when I'm having conversations with other folks who might not get it. It's like you're asking us to advocate and to sell you an ambulance. We shouldn't have to sell you an ambulance because we know that this works. We know we have 20 years of data and of evidence that shows that this works. And it's cost effective. The variety of different models that have been developed globally, there's models that will work in Winnipeg. And you saw in the very first video that people who use drugs know exactly what they need to stay alive. They know exactly what they need to keep their family members alive. They know exactly what they need to keep their community safe and livable for them, for the people that they love. Which brings you to your housing question. So the housing thing is a totally different, it requires all sorts of different approaches to it, but it also requires really creative ways that we think about how we're going to use urban spaces. And a lot of it means reclaiming, and again, coming back to that public good, reclaiming properties and things that we have assigned to people with resources and reclaiming them for people, because that's what you eventually have to do. There is no reason that there should be any vacant buildings or any vacant lots in downtown Winnipeg or in any part of Winnipeg, if we properly applied resources in the best interests of the common good. And that is up for communities to decide what their common good is. And the third thing is that when people are talking, so this is my favorite thing, is like, oh, but then we're gonna see people who are using drugs in our communities. You already do. That's actually kind of the appeal of Winnipeg. The appeal of Winnipeg is that we are not Toronto, we are not Vancouver, we are not Montreal, and we are very open, we are very raw, and we are very real, that this is a harsh place to live. This is part of our identity, and just friggin' lean into it. You're not going to create a livable Winnipeg by creating condos downtown that nobody's going to buy. That's not what people are doing. You're going to create a livable Winnipeg if it's livable for the people who live in those neighborhoods, because each neighborhood is different, and we've structured it that way. So that's it. So it's like, if you're looking to create Vancouver here, you're not going to do that. If you're looking to create I read this article about, like, there's people fleeing from downtown Calgary because there's more people who are using substances. It's like, no, people are fleeing because there's vacancies in Calgary because nobody's working there anymore. It's like, you're policing the wrong people here. You're imposing wrongs. The applications of justice here are flawed.
And I think also just like the reminding us that like our metric should be like, do we care? Are we fundamentally committed to keeping people alive? Like what Levi said, get through the day. If we want people to survive, then we create spaces for people to survive in. But often I think people are more driven by their own discomfort, their own fears of being in proximity to other people's suffering, or their sense of the ways that people should be living. But if we structure our policies and our interventions around keeping people alive in the ways that of their choosing, then I think we can, we will have a much more beautiful place.
Hey, Bronwyn, I have a question for you. So in your study of the NDP...
Hey, Rob.
Why is it that they fixate on this tough on crime stuff when you could say that they're sort of like moderately progressive on many other issues. I think it's maybe partly due to the power and influence of the unions that encompass the police and criminal justice workers. But I'm wondering what your thoughts are.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, if we understand the NDP as like a formation formed of in history kind of like a union of unions, labor, social democracy, and also social gospelers like J.S. Wordsworth, people who were kind of borderline moral reformers, early church people, no diss on church people, you know, whatever. We can see that, yeah, there's always been an impetus built into the NDP. Like, I was taught this grace when I was a kid, the J.S. Wordsworth grace, and I still say it sometimes because it is beautiful in many ways. But one line in it is, what we desire for ourselves, we wish for all. And to this end, may we take our place in the world's work and the world's struggles. But once I was interviewing the former deputy premier, and she's a historian herself, and she pulled out that line, what we desire for ourselves, we wish for all, as, you know, part of the impetus for the NDP. And I think that I'm getting too protracted and distracted now, but I think a lot of it has to do with liberal racism and, you know, settler colonialism and the desire to intervene in the lives of other people whose ways of life are seen to be, you know, unacceptable. I'm like not fully articulating it right now, but in the context of capitalism, and you know, the NDP is a party that is capitalist. They're not communist. Yeah, they have a particular commitment to particular types of work, standards of living, ways of relating to the land, territory, etc. That don't. I'm losing my train of thought. Rob, you had an answer already. So, yeah, sorry. Other Rob, yeah. Okay. So, yeah, of course, in contemporary NDP, unions are a huge force, right? They are absolutely beholden to unions. Public sector unions are one of the biggest forces right now demanding the expansion of policing and jails. MGEU, CUPE, etc. But I think that there's a little more to that is actually built into like the commitment to progressivism that NDPers understand in themselves, that's beyond just like a calculus for good jobs. It's actually like a settler colonial savior complex that has a particular progressive expression, I think, in the NDP. I don't know, I wrote it in a dissertation. It was a long time ago.
I just had a question about the idea that people know what's best for themselves to get through the day. And while I agree with the statement, I've also known a lot of substance users who refuse to acknowledge that they use substances at all or that it was damaging to them. And I've also known other substance users who lived in such stigma that even if maybe inside they did know that what they were doing wasn't best for them, it wasn't possible at all for them to change that. Is there any like kind of insight you have onto like helping people who either don't want to acknowledge or are maybe unaware that they're doing harm to themselves?
So I think if we go back to the central philosophy of unconditional love, that's really the nugget here. Like, but I acknowledge that theoretically that's beautiful, but practically that's a real challenge. So I think one of the things that you got to think about is you mentioned it in the framing of your question of stigma. So people internalize stigma and they deal with the feelings that come with stigma and being stigmatized in very different ways. And coming out of whatever it is that you need to disclose, or whatever it is that people want you to disclose, or whatever it is, those things are very challenging and they're part of an individual's journey. So yeah, it is never my job to say, you are actively engaged in harming yourself. That is never my job. Even if I friggin' think it's the stupidest decision that a person is making. I'm like, I can see it and I'm like, this is gonna backfire horribly on you. That is not my job. My job is to support that person. All I do is we provide them with all of the information that they need to best inform their decision. And if a person makes that decision, that is on them. And that is part of the trial and error piece of unconditional love and of kind of my own individual ethic. So it's like, I remember one time when I was working in Wichitawan, and there was this debate amongst different team members. A child had fallen down the stairs, and so like I heard some audible gasps. And we were talking about our own experiences being raised, and a lot of the times our parents would say once, you don't go over there, you're gonna fall and you're gonna hurt yourself, even as small children. And then the child fell. And then if you fell again, that was kind of on you, and you learn your lesson that way, because now you've made your own decision, you're smart enough, you're informed enough to make your own decision, and if you fall, that's kind of on you, right? Depending, on the child's age and whatever. And so that's also one of those things where it's like, in a Western system, at a certain point, that's child abuse. But for us, it was an integral way of how we learned how to navigate our own environment. I also think that it's really important if one of the reasons why I like to point out the imaginary graph of interventions that we had to do with the mobile overdose prevention site, and them being so high at the beginning and so low right now, when other folks are seeing the exact opposite, is the relationality. So if a person is feeling connected and safe in a space, they are going to do the things that they need to survive. And so even if in your situation, like even if you don't necessarily agree with, that person is causing harm to them, we don't know what that person is going through in that day. But we know that if you continually, every day, you show up and you see that person where they're at and you kind of give them whatever it is that your relationship looks like, that probably over time, that person is going to maybe do the things in a different way. Maybe. But we don't know. There's no answer to it. And that's part of the reason, is because we often look at substance use and people who use drugs as a problem or as a challenge when it requires, a lot of these things just require a complete restructuring of how we're perceiving them, because we've been ingrained to come at these things from this morally superior belief system that anytime you use drugs, you are flawed and you need help. And that is not true. You're not gonna police yourself, and I use that in the most, we're never gonna police ourselves out of this type of situation. And I use policing as the very real policing framework, and also as the policing of behaviors and the way things do. Because as human beings, since we've gathered in groups, we have done many things. We have formed social bonds with one another, imaginary social bonds through marriage and through kinship. And we've maintained those things, and part of the ways that we maintain those things is through a set of beliefs, and part of the ways that we come to understand or experience the world, all of us, globally almost, is through substance use. So we have been doing this for as long as we've been, eating. So it's just kind of like one of those things, but at some point in time, right around the 1930s, we're like, this is wrong. This is flawed, and it's particularly flawed when the face of people who use drugs is black and brown people, is poor people. And so one of the things that we always have to unpack when we're navigating interpersonal relationships is this person's substance use causing me harm? Because you also as an individual do not need to do that. If they are actively engaged in causing you harm, you have every right as an individual to set boundaries and to say, I cannot do this right now. But is my judgment informed by all of these other things that I've been, trained to learn? So that's a terrible answer to your very direct question. I realize that, but it's also very complicated, and it's a part of those. That's just kind of what it is.
Hi, Bronwyn, you mentioned resistance. Could you elaborate exactly on what that looks like, and how do we build the structures that carry it out?
Okay. I mean, I don't totally have the answer to that. But there is a quote in here, somewhere in my notes, that I wanted to highlight on from Ruth Wilson Gilmore in her book, Abolition Geography. And she says, ordinary people in changing diversity figure out how to stretch or diminish social and spatial forms to create room for their lives. Signs and traces of abolition geographies abound, even in their fragility. So that is a testament toward creating resistance by doing the things that I think both Levi and I have been talking about figuring out how to create space for lives that are, the systems that we live under are hostile toward. I wonder if someone else in the room wants to speak to that question. My brain is not working super astutely right now, and I know that there's lots of answers to that question in this room. Does anyone else want to speak to that question of resistance? I'm looking like at least 20 people who could, come.
Yeah, come on. Yeah. We got people online too, so they want to hear you. Or that one.
Hi, my name is Max. I work at the Rainbow Resource Center. Previously, I worked at the Manitoba Harm Reduction Network. To answer maybe obtusely your question, reminds me a lot of the work of Miriam Kaba, who's a very well-known abolitionist, and hearing Bronwyn cite Ruthie Gilmore reminded me of this as well, is that people are already doing the work. People are already resisting and understanding each other and their lives in community and in profound and deep ways. And to build resistance is to see that work and to lend your hands to that work. More than anything, people are already understanding the ways in which their lives are interwoven with each other and the ways in which the systems that we are embedded in prevent that connection. And so to imagine resistance is not to generate something whole cloth, but to weave ourselves into the lives of others.
Yeah, thank you, Max. That's what I was gonna say. And maybe you were asking concretely in relation to when I was talking about how to understand the breadth of carceral structures, we have to resist them and bump up against them. I mean, I think of those things concretely as identifying the ways that policing has encroached into different parts of our lives and resisting it, trying to get police out of schools, trying to get police out of the libraries, trying to get police out of healthcare, trying to disconnect police from teams of mental health workers, trying to, separate out to create community-based organizations and nonprofits who see their job not as sharing information with the police and creating nice spaces for community policing, but rather as creating spaces that can buffer people from the gaze and the surveillance of policing that happens out on the streets. So yeah, I think protecting each other from carceral incursion and building spaces that literally don't have cops in them. And when we try to do that, then we see how the cops are there to fight back to try to get into those spaces. We've seen that with schools, libraries, community centers, healthcare, et cetera.
Good job. You guys were great. That's actually a good segue into my question. This is more practical than theoretical. Just 1 second. So I work downtown, the Hydro Building, and there's this like kind of nasty, pervasive thread throughout a lot of our like safety talks put on by our office that talk about like downtown safety and how to like keep yourself safe. And it's very like anti-community and very like anti, like we spend like a third of our weeks down there, but we're not part of it. We're having to hide from it. And part of that was during one of our department meetings, they brought in the downtown safety community, I don't know. And to me, like they were using a lot of the good buzzwords like community building and safety, but then there's like the forever like suspicious and cynical part of me that's like, I'm pretty sure you're just like the foot patrol with green hats. Like, I'm just kind of wondering, because it did seem to me like the optimist in me was like, okay, it seems like they're coming from a different frame, but like, are they really? And I'm curious to know, as people who like actively work, have you seen, like, should I, they say like, oh, call us if you see someone who's unsafe. And like what I really hear that as is call us if you see someone that's making you feel unsafe, which is like garbage. But, are they helping? Is this a step up from what was there? Should I be like, if I see someone that looks in distress, flagging down a green hat, or like, no?
So I'm going to be frank, and it's probably going to surprise you, but I actually like the DCSP. So the Downtown Community Safety Patrol, in my view, is a pretty interesting example of how communities can kind of come together pragmatically in the best interests of one another. So we have to understand that downtown Winnipeg is a very cosmopolitan place. We often will speak about it in a very different type of way. Like one of the most cosmopolitan spaces that I've ever been in my life was probably Portage Place when I was a University of Winnipeg student. You could walk in there, you could hear multiple different languages happening, you could have people, multiple different indigenous languages, multiple different languages from all over the world. It's not so much right now, but that's kind of what it was. But also as part of cosmopolitanism, we have to also learn how to exist with very competing ideas of what that common good looks like. And so what I like, I have my own personal critiques of DCSP, and we actually have a pretty good working relationship with them at Sunshine House. One of the things that I like about them is philosophically they're in this really awkward position that many of us are in when we last year Sunshine House took $25,000 from TD Bank. That is a problem. Ethically and morally, that is a problem. However, I still have to pay my staff. Right? There's still certain things that need to happen. So a lot of us all the time, we figure out ways that we suspend and we can kind of put our beliefs and our ethics and our morals on hold for a minute to do what you want in the good, in the common good. And I think DCSP is kind of like a living example of that. I know that there are a number of different competing interests, but there are a lot of really interesting people who have a lot of good community experience working there and informing the decisions. And so when they're talking about safety, sometimes we might have very differing views on how that works. At the end of the day, they're largely concerned about the safety of the individual and not the business. So I think that that's a pretty good way to juxtapose that answer.
Yeah, I think that that's a great question, and I've been confused about it too. Where are you, Mikeland? Oh, here, over there. Like their lineage they are kind of a rebranded Biz Patrol, but some of the ways in which they've been rebranded, I think, are contradictory and interesting. they are connected to the police. I think that some of the questions that we need to be asking of these types of, safety forces that inevitably arise when the police are faced with a crisis of legitimacy, which happened in the context, it's happened over and over in the past 100 years that the police have existed as we know them, but there's an effort to rebrand security, to speak to some of the concerns that brought the crisis of legitimacy to the fore. I think True North is still a major player in the Downtown Community Safety Partnership, in governing it. They're still fundamentally concerned with preserving that downtown area as an area that's profitable, and I think they're maybe interested in and curious about the degree to which it could be profitable to have a nicer looking security force that is perhaps more diverse, that does perhaps take a bit of a different approach, but they're not the same as, say, Persons Community Solutions that runs the Community Safety Host program in the library, that's run by peers, that does peer-led kind of community safety hosts. There are important differences. I think one interesting thing that I have noticed, I saw some Downtown Community Safety Patrol people hanging around at the Forks, adjacent to a cop and a security guard and an RCMP person. And just culturally speaking, those three white dudes were yucking it up together and talking. And the two DCSP people were totally socially outside of that sphere. And I thought that was interesting. I was like, yeah, well, so there's at least that they're seriously, that they're not in concert in this taken for granted way that I think policing and security sometimes comes together to just, unite to be like, well, we know what to do in this situation. There's a little bit of curiosity there, but I think that, I'm interested to see how it plays out.
Thanks. I serve with the Thunderbirds. We're big Sunshine House fans, and we've called on DCSP a couple times too, and it's always been a positive outcome. And one time they knew the person that by name, because they're part of the community. Well, good, that's not my phone. But they did do a Instagram tank selfie during the, we all saw that. The question about, I would love the Sunshine House anti-space model where we listen to the community and let them tell us what they need. And that's the best approach in my opinion. And my question is, how scalable is that? When you get a lot of funding, do you find that not Sunshine House, but when organizations grow because they want to serve more, there's other players involved. Can that be maintained? Is it scalable?
I want to say that I think that's a really important question because it gets asked to us all the time. It's like, how do we do what you're doing? And it's like, I don't know. I don't know. What are you doing? What's your actual problem? And then maybe we can see if we can help you find a solution because we don't know. I think one of my cautions is that Winnipeg has a very because Winnipeg is located where it's located, we don't have a very diverse economy, and so there's a lot of real need to keep, as we've talked about with unions and we've talked about with other folks, but there's a real need to maintain a certain level of status quo in these so-called helping agencies. And so I think that's one of the things that we got to realize is that there's a real need to maintain EIA. There's a real need to actually have these, because if we don't, all of the people who are in that workforce, where are they going to go? There's a need to maintain such a large child and family services monster, because where are those people going to be employed? So fundamentally, as a society, we got to ask, why are we maintaining these systems? And then the other part is back to systems. So is Sunshine House scalable? I don't know, because what we're doing right now, it works for us, and might not work for each organization, and each organization has to understand what it is that they want to do. We all go into work every day, and I think it's a pretty healthy way to kind of go into work, knowing that in 5 years' time, it's very likely that none of us will work there. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. That should be actually a goal. It should be a goal that organizations need to change, they need to adapt, and we are not, as my grandma always said, the minute you try to be everything for everybody, you're gonna be nothing for nobody. And so I think that's really the key in a lot of the ways that we approach it. So if it's, and the other thing about when you scale something, then it becomes a system, and then it becomes a structure. And then structures are reinforced through rules and regulations and policies and procedures, and they become blanket ways of of maintaining whatever solution that you've proposed is. And that's what makes an auntie's house so cool, is there's no structure. You walk in there, you're like, who the hell's in charge here? Like, where did this food come from? Like, who actually works in this place? Like, how are you getting money? And it's like, mind your business and eat your food, and that's it. So that's, I don't know if it's scalable, but I think it's like, it can be scalable for certain things, and I think one of the things that we can really look at is the way that different types of models of care are being proposed, particularly with Gani Ganijik's Aunties, the Wellness Lodge, and the Aunties Go Ask Auntie program, and the way that they've really changing the way Indigenous communities and inner city communities are working around extremely high rates of STBBI infections. And so, like, I think that type of model is scalable. If you're talking about a care and the provision of care, it only makes sense that it's caring, right? And that it's based and rooted in how people interact with love and care and health.
So I want to honor our guest's time. I think, would you like to ask the final question? Were you coming up for one, or? Yeah, so one more question, and then we'll conclude after that. Go ahead.
Hi, so I work at a service industry job, so I deal with a lot of public, so I get to sort of have conversations and see sort of the same people in my community. And yeah, oftentimes, usually people are pretty understanding and sort of see each other as other human beings. But you get the odd one out where someone makes a comment or something happens where someone views someone lesser than them. And sometimes I get a feeling of like frustration or something where it's like, why do you think that way? Or sort of like, why do you view this person this way when they could very much relate to you in some way or have the same sort of struggles that you do? I guess my question is, how can we have those conversations with those kind of people that comes from a place where it's not hostile and it sort of shows them that like, hey, like this is just as much of a human being as like any other person?
So again, like kind of going back to the previous question about like how do we interact with people whose decisions we're not necessarily in agreement with, you got to value your own labor that you want to. If I'm invited to a room and I know that 35% of that room doesn't view me as a human being deserving of rights and deserving of a reason to live, I am not going to waste an ounce of energy on that person. And that's not because, and that's also my own safety, but it's also, so the other root of Jawe, the Anishinaabe word, is to pity. And so that's another way. So part of love and part of understanding how you kind of can give love is also deeply connected to pity. And pity is not necessarily puts you at a place of superiority, is common in all Anishinaabe teachings, is that we are going to all be in a place where we can provide that love and where we need that love. And so I think that's one of the safety things that you can do for yourself is like, is this person really worth my time and energy of having this conversation? And then the other thing is, and if they are, you know, just, I don't know, just keep doing what you can do. But sometimes people just aren't going to be receptive to it, and that's just the reality. And then you got to continually have these conversations with folks. And empathy, which is very different from sympathy, it's a very useful tool in creating that kind of connection. But that's all I got.
Well, thanks again for offering so much wisdom and insight and your experience and knowledge. So let's give them a sign of a show of appreciation again. Okay. So if you maybe had one last question, you might be able to snag them before they sneak out the door. But otherwise, thanks so much for coming and have a good night.